Hi, I'm Jude, and today I'll be taking you through Japanese American internment during World War II. Specifically, I'll be contextualizing how political developments in the 20th century influenced the US government's decision to intern Japanese Americans, how various groups reacted to this policy, the realities of the internment experience, its short and long term consequences, and its impact on civil rights, legal precedent, and Japanese American communities. So, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II was a major social and political consequence of decades of anti-Asian sentiment in the United States, which was amplified by wartime hysteria following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Long before the attack on Pearl Harbor, though, restrictive policies such as the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act and the Gentlemen's Agreement of 1907 had long marginalized Asian immigrants, particularly in the West. White labor unions, politicians, and nativist groups fearing economic competition lobbied for exclusionary policies such as California's alien land laws, which barred Japanese immigrants from owning land. The Immigration Act of 1924 codified this discrimination by banning Japanese immigration entirely and classifying them as, quote, aliens ineligible for citizenship. Anti-Asian groups such as the Asiatic Exclusion League had gained traction by lobbying for laws that restricted property ownership and citizenship for Japanese immigrants. Now, in particular, the period after the Meiji Restoration characterized significant sociopolitical changes in Japan, including increased immigration due to economic strain caused by Japan's sudden integration into the global economy. Between 1869 and 1924, around 200,000 Japanese immigrated to Hawaii and the US seeking labor opportunities, primarily in agriculture. The influence of Japanese immigrants faced substantial resistance, actually, from European Americans, especially on the West Coast, where fears of economic competition led to discriminatory actions. As we said, anti-Asian groups gained traction and they lobbied for laws that restricted property ownership and citizenship for Japanese immigrants. This resulted in an Immigration Act of 1924, as we said, banned Japanese immigration and created a clear generational divide between the Issei, or immigrants, and the Neisei, or native-born U.S. citizens. Despite these racial restrictions, Japanese Americans established communities, especially in agriculture, specifically by introducing innovations like irrigation techniques. They built strong social networks through prefectural associations and women associations, such that they created both community and economic ties in Japantowns. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, a climate of suspicion and fear led to mass incarceration of Japanese Americans, and Executive Order 9066 authorized the removal and incarceration of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of whom were U.S. citizens. The internment camps, often located in desolate regions such as Manzanar and Tule Lake, were sites of harsh conditions where families were separated and their homes, businesses, and lives were dismantled. This decision was motivated by wartime paranoia and racial prejudice, despite reports that found no evidence of disloyalty among Japanese Americans. By early 1942, public sentiment sharply shifted, and they were motivated by fears of espionage and, quote, fifth column activity, despite the lack of evidence substantiating these claims. The pressure from local governments and citizens, in conjunction with the influence of military officials like General John L. DeWitt, led to the forced relocation and internment of Japanese Americans. So, despite reports from officials like FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover dismissing espionage concerns, the government's actions were legitimized by the Roberts Commission report, which vaguely alluded to potential espionage by Japanese Americans. This created sort of an environment where Japanese Americans were otherized as a monolithic enemy group, regardless of their citizenship status or loyalty. And you can see how the sentiment was reflected in political discourse as well, through John DeWitt's insistence on excluding all persons of Japanese ancestry, regardless of citizenship, and in President Franklin D. Roosevelt's signing of Executive Order 9066, which granted military authorities the power to designate exclusion zones and forcibly remove individuals based solely on their ethnic background. So, Executive Order 9066, signed on February 19, 1942, granted military commanders authority to designate military areas from which individuals could be excluded. While the order did not specifically mention Japanese Americans, it was used to justify their exclusion from the West Coast, including parts of California, Oregon, Washington, and Arizona. General John DeWitt's March 2nd, 1942 proclamation created military areas number 1 and number 2, and by March 27th of that same year, Japanese Americans were prohibited from leaving these areas. Alaska, though initially not included, also saw forced removals by April 1942, with detainees sent to relocation camps such as Minidoka. The government's policy of voluntary evacuation quickly changed into one of forced relocation, with the first group sent from Bainbridge Island, Washington to Manzanar on March 24th, 1942, which started the broader removal process that resulted in a total of 108 exclusion orders by August 1942. Non-military advocates of exclusion, removal, and detention of Japanese Americans were motivated by a combination of self-interest, racial prejudice, and wartime hysteria. Many white farmers, especially in California, saw the internment as a convenient way to eliminate competition posed by Japanese American farmers who had successfully cultivated large swaths of farmland. As Austin E. Anson, managing secretary of the Salinas Vegetable Growers Shipper Association, asserted, removing Japanese Americans would allow white farmers to take over their land and agricultural businesses without resistance in the fertile agricultural regions of the West Coast. Their rhetoric reflected a belief that the Japanese presence was a threat to their livelihoods and the dominant racial order, which goes to show how economic interests align with discriminatory views such that they justified forced relocation. Alongside economic motivations, popular discourse among journalists, politicians, and some segments of the public amplified anti-Japanese sentiment. The Robert Commission report, which basically sought to associate Japanese Americans with espionage following Pearl Harbor, created a narrative of collective guilt by associating Japanese ancestry with disloyalty. Specifically, columnists like Henry McLemore and editorials from newspapers like the Los Angeles Times echoed this view by portraying Japanese Americans as inherently untrustworthy regardless of their citizenship status. Now, there were many military justifications for Japanese internment. The Nihao incident in December 1941, shortly after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, was one of them, and it involved a Japanese pilot who crash landed on the Hawaiian island of Nihao. 3 Japanese Americans, including 2 who had been born in the US, assisted the pilot, leading to suspicion that Japanese Americans could be aiding the enemy. However, despite this incident, Territorial Governor Joseph Poindexter rejected calls for mass incarceration because he recognized that such a move would be excessive and detrimental to the Hawaiian economy. The cryptographic justification for Japanese American internment also was from fears regarding espionage, based on U.S. code-breaking efforts, notably the magic intercepts. Some argued that incarcerating Japanese Americans would prevent the disclosure of sensitive intelligence, such as the success of American code-breaking operations, which might be exposed during espionage trials. This reasoning was heavily criticized for justifying widespread racial discrimination and disloyalty accusations without evidence, because studies later showed little support for claims that Japanese Americans were engaging in espionage. The reactions from Black and Jewish communities to Japanese American incarceration were actually largely muted. While some Jewish and Black civil rights groups such as the NAACP voiced occasional opposition, the majority of the public, including many from marginalized groups, did not actively challenge the policy. For example, George S. Schuyler, a prominent African American journalist, criticized the incarceration, warning that such government actions against Japanese Americans could easily be applied to other minority groups. The shared experience of racial discrimination created an undercurrent of support for reparations of African Americans in later years. The Japanese American internment experience involved multiple types of facilities with varying purposes and conditions. The Department of Justice operated camps, primarily for non-citizen Japanese Americans suspected of disloyalty or, quote, enemy sympathies, were managed by the Immigration and Naturalization Service and guarded by Border Patrol agents. The Army managed some incarceration camps specifically for Japanese Americans deemed, quote, potentially dangerous. Additionally, the Wartime Civil Control Administration and civil assembly centers were temporary holding sites, often converted from racetracks or fairgrounds, where Japanese Americans were detained before being moved to more permanent relocation camps. These centers housed individuals in crowded conditions with makeshift barracks, communal latrines, and mess halls, which goes to show the chaotic and rushed nature of the forced relocation process. The assembly center served as the first step in the internment process, where over 90,000 Japanese Americans were temporarily held before being transferred to the more permanent War Relocation Authority camps. So the conditions in the Japanese American camps were harsh and often dehumanizing. Inmates were housed in makeshift barracks made of tar paper and wood with insufficient facilities for cooking, plumbing, or privacy. Overcrowded living spaces, sometimes housing 25 people in rooms designed for only 4, created difficult living conditions. The camps were located in remote areas with armed guards patrolling the perimeters. Medical care was also inadequate because the overworked and underpaid medical staff struggled to meet the needs of the detainees. Thus, health conditions worsened due to unsanitary living spaces, food poisoning, and outbreaks of diseases like dysentery. Despite this, the camps did offer some form of healthcare, though it was limited by shortages of staff and supplies. In addition to inequitable pay for Japanese American medical workers, education in the internment camps faced significant challenges because the government failed to provide adequate resources or planning for the schooling of over 30,000 detained children. Schools were overcrowded and the teacher-student ratio was high, with classes lacking necessary materials such as books, desks, and notebooks. Despite these difficulties, students in the camps managed to continue their education, with some being able to attend college outside the camps through the National Japanese American Student Recreation Program, which allowed a limited number of college students to leave the camps and continue their education, often with the support of sympathetic colleges and private foundations. The program was almost a sort of resistance to the injustices of internment, as many second-generation Japanese Americans attended prestigious universities. Despite the oppressive conditions, Japanese Americans in the camps managed to maintain a sense of cultural continuity through sports, particularly baseball, which became an important form of recreation, and these activities provided a sense of normalcy and even camaraderie. Additionally, the Tule Lake Agricultural Program allowed inmates to participate in farming, both to feed the camps and learn new skills. The program produced various crops including Japanese vegetables like daikon and offered employment opportunities. Despite their forced relocation and imprisonment, many detainees found ways to preserve their Japanese traditions. In early 1943, the War Relocation Authority circulated the Loyalty Questionnaire, which was a tool intended to assess the loyalty of incarcerated Nisei men for potential military service. The questionnaire, which became a point of contention, included questions that many interpreted as deeply insulting, such as swearing unqualified allegiance to the U.S. and renouncing loyalty to Japan. Those who answered no to both questions, often out of confusion or fear, were segregated at Tule Lake, which was a maximum security facility that housed individuals deemed disloyal. The government also passed the Renunciation Act of 1944, which allowed individuals to renounce their U.S. citizenship, and a significant number actually did so out of mistreatment and fear. The renunciations became a highly controversial aspect of the internment, with critics arguing that they were coerced under duress, and historians suggesting that they reflected emotional defiance rather than true disloyalty. Despite this, many Japanese Americans tried to prove their loyalty to the United States by volunteering for military service. Some 33,000 Japanese American men, including many Nisei, from internment camps, served in the U.S. military, with 20,000 joining the Army. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed primarily of Japanese Americans, became one of the most decorated units in U.S. military history, and they served in the European theater. Their participation in the war was seen as an effort to demonstrate their patriotism and loyalty to a country that had wrongfully incarcerated their families. Women also contributed by serving in the Women's Army Corps and Army Nurse Corps. So in 1944, the Korematsu versus United States decision upheld the constitutionality of the wartime internment of Japanese Americans, with the court justifying the exclusion based on the idea of military necessity, which we discussed prior. This decision legitimized the forced removal of over 100,000 Japanese Americans from their West Coast homes, because they deemed it as a national security measure during World War II. However, the concurrent ex parte Endo ruling emphasized that local American citizens could not be unlawfully detained, meaning that the government could not indefinitely incarcerate those without cause. Korematsu versus United States, despite its legal support for the internment, is almost a symbol of judicial endorsement of racial prejudice that has been criticized for its role in upholding systemic racism and violating our civil liberties during wartime. The internment of Japanese Americans formally ended with the closure of the War Relocation Authority camps by the end of 1945. After the Supreme Court's decisions in both of these cases rescinded the military exclusion orders through Public Proclamation No. 21, it allowed Japanese Americans to return to the West Coast in January 1945. However, many former detainees had already relocated to other parts of the U.S. for work or educational opportunities, and those who remained faced immense challenges as they returned to homes and businesses that had been lost or destroyed. The legal and societal resolution of the internment came much later, though, with the Japanese American redress movement leading to the passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. This act provided formal compensation and an apology to surviving detainees for the wrongful incarceration. The U.S. government's apology, coupled with $20,000 reparations, marked the formal end of internment. The social impact of internment was significant because Japanese Americans were forced to assimilate and distance themselves from their ethnic identity in an effort to regain social acceptance. Pre-war organizations like the Japanese Association and Chamber of Commerce disbanded, and membership in ethnic churches sharply declined. The internment experience also promoted a sense of distrust toward the US government, resulting in the redress movement in the 1970s and 80s, which ultimately led to the formal apology and reparations provided by the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 and the Japanese American Claims Act by President Harry Truman. Despite these efforts, the effect of discrimination continued to shape Japanese American communities' memories of their wartime experience. Thank you.